On April 5, 1994, Kurt Cobain, the voice of a generation, the frontman of Nirvana, died inside a greenhouse above the garage of his Seattle home. More than 30 years later, a private investigator, a punk musician, a handwriting analyst, a retired police captain, and a team of forensic specialists have all pointed fingers in the same direction, and the person they believe is responsible has never been charged with a single crime. So let's break down exactly what happened in the final days of Kurt Cobain, and why some people believe his killer is still walking free. Seattle, April 8, 1994, 9 a.m. An electrician named Gary Smith arrived at Kurt Cobain's home to install a new security system. There was no answer at the front door, but Smith got to work anyway. As he climbed onto the roof, following wires along the garage to a room above it, he looked through a window. Inside, he saw an overturned plant and what he thought was a mannequin lying beside it. Then he noticed the blood. He called the police. Kurt Cobain, the lead singer and guitarist of the American rock band Nirvana, was found dead at his home on Lake Washington Boulevard in Seattle. Forensic investigators and a coroner determined that Cobain had died on approximately April 5th. 3 days prior, the Seattle Police Department incident report stated that Cobain was found with a Remington Model 11 shotgun across his body and had suffered a visible gunshot wound to the head. A suicide note was discovered nearby. Seattle police confirmed his death as a suicide. A high concentration of heroin and traces of Valium were found in Cobain's bloodstream. A suicide note with a pen stuck through it was found inside a flower pot. A Remington Model 11 20-gauge shotgun, purchased for Cobain by his friend, musician Dylan Carlson, was found on Cobain's chest. That was the official story. Case closed. A rock star ravaged by addiction and depression ended his own life at 27. But within days of that body being discovered, people started asking questions. The first was a public access TV host in Seattle, Richard Lee, aired the first episode of an ongoing series called Kurt Cobain Was Murdered, saying there were several discrepancies in the police reports, including several changes in the nature of the shotgun blast. Then came the private investigator, a former LA County Sheriff's detective named Tom Grant. Grant, who had been hired by Courtney Love herself to find Cobain after his departure from drug rehabilitation, said he believes that Cobain was murdered. And Grant didn't just believe it quietly. He went to the Seattle police within days of the body being found. He was on the phone to the Seattle police trying to go to them the day the body was found, and was more or less blown off on the telephone. Then, 2 years later, a punk musician made a claim on camera that changed everything, or should have, and 8 days after that claim, that musician was dead. The story of Kurt Cobain's alleged killer is not about one smoking gun. It is about a chain of events from a hotel room in Rome to a greenhouse in Seattle to railroad tracks in California that, depending on who you believe, either adds up to the most tragic suicide in rock history or one of the most brazen cover-ups in American criminal history. To understand why people believe Kurt Cobain was murdered, you have to understand the state of his marriage in early 1994 and what happened in Rome 1 month before his death. Cobain's wife, Hole leader Courtney Love, joined her husband in Rome. While he was convalescing from a rather sudden throat ailment, his voice had given out a few days before, causing the cancellation of his band's European tour. On March 3, 1994, Nirvana frontman Kurt Cobain slipped into an overdose-induced coma in Rome, Italy. His stomach was pumped and emptied. Shortly thereafter, he was moved to Rome American Hospital, where he regained consciousness a few hours later. For years, debate has raged over whether this incident was just another in a series of accidental overdoses, or whether it might have been a legitimate suicide attempt. The official narrative was straightforward. Cobain mixed Rohypnol, a powerful sedative, with champagne, and nearly died. His management agency, Gold Mountain Records, said that the overdose was accidental and that he was ill from influenza and fatigue. However, Courtney Love later confirmed that the overdose had been a suicide attempt. But not everyone agreed with Courtney's version. Journalists Ian Halperin and Max Wallace contacted Dr. Osvaldo Galletta, who treated Cobain after the incident. Galletta contested the claim that the Rome overdose was a suicide attempt. He said, "We can usually tell a suicide attempt. This didn't look like one to me," and also contradicted Love's claim that 50 Rohypnol pills were removed from Cobain's stomach. This discrepancy would become a cornerstone of the murder theory. If the Rome incident was not a suicide attempt, then the idea that Cobain had a pattern of suicidal behavior weakens considerably. And if Courtney Love was lying about Rome, The question becomes why. Private investigator Tom Grant had an answer. He asserts that Love had financial motivation, both in the form of rumors that Cobain was planning to divorce her, and the fact that Cobain had turned down an offer to headline the 1994 Lollapalooza festival for nearly $10 million. Grant stated that his interpretation comes from a totally different perspective than anybody else's, saying, "I know absolutely without any doubt, and there will never be any problem proving this in a court of law, that Kurt Cobain was leaving Courtney." Grant said there was a divorce in the works, with a lot of talk about separation. Courtney had an album coming out soon. The obvious motive in a situation like this, Grant argued, was would she benefit more from a suicide or from a divorce? And if Kurt Cobain committed suicide, she would get everything. Based on evidence gathered in interviews, journalists Halperin and Wallace believed that Cobain wanted to divorce Love near the time of his death, and that she was looking for a vicious divorce lawyer to help crush a prenuptial agreement she had reportedly signed that would keep their respective fortunes separate in the event of a divorce. The Rome overdose happened on March 3. By March 18th, things had escalated even further. A domestic dispute escalated into a near disaster after police officers arrived at the scene, summoned by Love. She told them that her husband had locked himself in a room with a .38 caliber revolver and said he was going to kill himself. Less than 3 weeks later, Kurt Cobain was dead. The most persistent voice in the murder conspiracy is not a fan, not a journalist, and not a conspiracy theorist living in a basement somewhere. It is Tom Grant, a licensed private investigator, a former detective with the LA County Sheriff's Department, and he was hired by Courtney Love herself. On March 30th, 1994, Cobain checked himself into the Exodus Recovery Center outside Los Angeles, seeking help for his drug problems. Meanwhile, his wife Courtney Love was in LA doing press for the release of Hole's new record, Live Through This. After 3 days at Exodus, Kurt scaled the compound's 6-foot wall and caught a plane back home. Upon learning of her husband's escape, Courtney hired Tom Grant, an LA-based private investigator, to find him. Grant had an assistant in Seattle set up surveillance on the Cobain residence, along with a dope house where Kurt was thought to buy narcotics. At the same time, Kurt's mother, Wendy O'Connor, fearing her son might be suicidal, filed a missing person report with the Seattle police. But Grant noticed something strange almost immediately. He says the police were set up to find a suicide by Courtney when she called in the missing persons report, lying as she claimed to be Kurt's mother on the phone, and said he left the rehab, flew to Seattle, bought a shotgun, and may be suicidal. According to the timeline that Grant himself documented and which he recorded on audio tape, Love hired him on April 3rd, Easter Sunday, to try to find her missing husband, but conveniently left out critical information. Cobain had been seen by their nanny at his own house on April 2nd. She had Grant search everywhere except their house until April 6th. This would become one of the most damning details in Grant's theory, that Love was deliberately keeping the private investigator away from the one place where Cobain's body would eventually be found. Upon his arrival home at around 2 a.m. on April 2nd, Kurt had a brief exchange with Michael DeWitt, the male live-in nanny that he and Courtney had hired. At 8 a.m., Kurt had breakfast, then went to a sporting goods store to buy cartridges for a recently acquired Remington M11 20-gauge shotgun. Grant also noticed peculiarities with the so-called suicide note. He said it makes it a lot easier to understand the note Cobain left. When you know he was leaving Courtney, they found out 7 months later he also left her another note that she never told Grant about. It was never mentioned in the police reports, and Courtney's own attorney, Rosemary Carroll, never knew about it either. Grant has stated that the events surrounding Cobain's death are filled with lies, contradictions in logic, and countless inconsistencies, and that Courtney Love, her lawyers, and many of Courtney's industry supporters have engaged in an effort to keep the public from learning the real facts of this case. Grant's theory had several pillars, but the most scientifically explosive one was this: Cobain could not have injected himself with such a large dose of heroin and still have been able to pull the trigger. Kurt had 225 milligrams of heroin in his blood, 3 times the lethal dose. There were intravenous punctures in both arms. The shotgun itself raised its own problems. It wasn't examined by Seattle police until a full month later, and when it was, there were only unidentifiable smudged fingerprints, as if it had been wiped down. But if he had bought the gun weeks before, why weren't there other prints on it? In the original police report, it said that marks on Cobain's hands were consistent with firing a gun. 2 years later, the police admitted that this detail was actually a mistake, added by a rookie cop at the scene. Grant didn't go quietly. As a private investigator, he had no authority to file charges or reopen the official police investigation, so he limited his time and efforts to keeping the Cobain case in the public eye. Through his website at cobaincase.com, as well as radio, television, and magazine interviews that he continued to do on a regular basis. Since Cobain's death in 1994, Grant's theory has been analyzed and questioned by several books, television shows, and films, including the 2015 docudrama Soaked in Bleach. If Tom Grant's investigation is the spine of the murder theory, then the story of Eldon El Duce Hoke is the most chilling chapter. Eldon Wayne Hoke, nicknamed El Duce, was an American musician, best known as the drummer and lead singer of the shock rock band The Mentors. He was not the sort of person most people would consider a credible witness to anything. He was crude, alcoholic, and built his entire career on being deliberately offensive. But in the mid-1990s, El Duce started telling a very specific story. In 1996, a punk musician named Eldon El Duce Hoke claimed that 3 years earlier, Courtney Love had offered him $50,000 to murder Kurt Cobain. Hoke even passed an on-screen polygraph test with his claim. In Nick Broomfield's documentary Kurt Courtney, the book Who Killed Kurt Cobain presents evidence from Tom Grant and from El Duce, who claimed he was offered $50,000 to kill Cobain, and allegedly passed a lie detector test that was carried out by the world's top polygraphist. El Duce didn't just claim that the offer was made. He claimed he knew who actually carried out the killing. In his interview for the Kurt Courtney film, recorded on April 11, 1997, El Duce again claimed that Love had offered him $50,000 to whack Kurt Cobain, and further claimed that he knew who did kill Cobain, giving the name Alan, but said he would let the FBI catch him. The name Alan that El Duce mentioned was believed by some to refer to a person from the band Kill Alan Wrench, though this was never confirmed by authorities or substantiated beyond El Duce's own statements. One day after his final performance at Al's Bar in downtown Los Angeles, and 2 days after filming an interview for the Kurt Courtney documentary, during which he claimed that Courtney Love had asked him to kill Kurt Cobain, Hoke was found dead on the railroad tracks in Riverside, California, on Saturday, April 19, 1997. After being struck by a train, the coroner's office gave the official cause of death as misadventure. The timing was staggering. According to the book Who Killed Kurt Cobain, El Duce showed up at his friend Drew Gallagher's home on April 17, 1997, asking where he could go to get a fake driver's license. Hoke was incredibly paranoid and nervous at this time. When Gallagher asked what he meant, Hoke responded, "People get buried in cornfields. People get lost in swamps," meaning he was in fear for his life. 2 days later, he was dead. According to people who knew him, while staying with band bass player Steve Dr. Heathen Scumbroy in Riverside, he drunkenly wandered onto train tracks, passed out cold, and was run over by an oncoming train. Was El Duce a credible figure by almost any standard? No. He was a known provocateur and a severe alcoholic. But the polygraph test, the specific name he dropped on camera, and his death days later, these details were enough to keep the conspiracy theory burning for decades, and nobody ever investigated the Allen claim in any official capacity. For more than 30 years, the Seattle Police Department and the King County Medical Examiner's Office have stood by the original ruling. Kurt Cobain died by suicide. The Seattle Police Department ruled it a suicide early into their investigation, and while there were some lingering questions, further investigation did not change this ruling. 20 years later, prior to the anniversary of Cobain's death, the police reinvestigated and reconfirmed the ruling, in part to clear up lingering theories that the death was a murder. In 2014, ahead of the 20th anniversary of Cobain's death, Seattle Police Department cold case detective Mike Ciasinski reviewed the case, and the department released dozens of previously unseen crime scene photos. Despite these efforts at transparency, conspiracy theories have persisted. In 2016, the same detective released photos of the gun Cobain used in response to a public records request after CBS News sought the images to help quell a conspiracy theory that the gun had been melted down in a supposed SPD cover-up. But the voices challenging the ruling have never gone silent. In fact, they've grown louder. In February 2026, a new team of independent forensic specialists published a report that reignited the entire debate. A group of private forensic specialists, led by Canadian blogger and self-described investigator Michelle Wilkins, published a report arguing that Cobain's 1994 death may have been staged. Their findings, released in the open-access International Journal of Forensic Sciences, concluded that Cobain was a homicide victim and that the scene was manipulated to resemble a suicide. Over time, Wilkins assembled a team of specialists in firearms analysis, toxicology, and questioned documents. They also gained support from Mark Larson, a former longtime chief of the criminal division at the King County Prosecutor's Office, who said he believes the case was under-investigated. Cobain presumably would not have been able to operate the shotgun based on the significant amount of heroin that had been injected into his system. The heroin kit at the death scene was found several feet away and appeared neatly organized. Cobain's alleged suicide note appears to have been finished by another hand. Wilkins pointed out, there are things in the autopsy that go, well, wait, this person didn't die very quickly of a gunshot blast. He's dying of an overdose, and so he can barely breathe. His blood isn't pumping very much. I mean, he's in a coma, and he's holding this up to be able to reach the trigger to get it in his mouth. It's crazy. The independent researchers' report noted that the placement of heroin supplies found near Cobain's body was suspicious, such as needles allegedly being capped. Wilkins said, "We're supposed to believe he capped the needles and put everything back in order after shooting up 3 times, because that's what someone does while they're dying." Wilkins highlighted that the bulk of the suicide note reads more like a retirement letter from the music industry, which, she argues, appear to be scrawled in different handwriting. The team alleges this could point to forgery, further supporting their theory of a staged scene. Adding to the suspicion, investigators found a receipt for the shotgun and for the shells in Cobain's pocket, while the shells themselves were lined up at his feet. 2 separate handwriting analyses concluded the final 4 lines of the note were not Kurt Cobain's. The report also references an individual who allegedly claimed to have seen others forcibly inject Cobain prior to his death. According to Wilkins' team, that person was never interviewed by police. A retired Seattle police captain named Neil Lowe, who spent 50 years with the Seattle Police Department and was given full access to the case file, came forward as well. He was asked by his chief to audit the Kurt Cobain case in 2005. He told the Daily Mail that he's just not buying that Kurt did that to himself, describing the original investigation as botched and stating, "I've read the case, and I can tell you what the evidence says because that's what I did for a living. And it does say not suicide." But for every voice challenging the suicide ruling, there has been a response. Former Nirvana manager Danny Goldberg, a friend of Cobain, emphasized Cobain's erratic and depressed behavior in the days and weeks leading up to his death, stating, "It's ridiculous. He killed himself. I saw him the week beforehand. He was depressed. He tried to kill himself 6 weeks earlier. He'd talked and written about suicide a lot. He was on drugs, he got a gun." Death investigator Joseph Scott Morgan noted that although the amount of heroin in Cobain's system was beyond the dosage most people might tolerate, the musician had a history of drug abuse, and his tolerance level would be through the roof. As to whether Cobain could have operated the shotgun, Morgan said that depends on whether his motor skills would have been compromised, and that Cobain may have ingested a large amount of heroin and then used the firearm as part of a strategy of redundancy to end his life. Forensic linguist Carol Chasky agreed with the official suicide verdict, Suicide Note Assessment Review, and it was classified as a suicide note, both the top portion and the bottom portion. Nick Broomfield, who directed the Kurt Courtney documentary that fueled so much of the conspiracy, himself said in the end that he had not uncovered enough evidence to conclude the existence of a conspiracy. In a 1998 interview, he stated, "I think that he committed suicide. I don't think that there's a smoking gun, and I think there's only one way you can explain a lot of things around his death. Not that he was murdered, but that there was just a lack of caring for him. I just think that Courtney had moved on, and he was expendable." Courtney Love has denied any involvement in Kurt Cobain's death for over 30 years, and has never been charged with any crime related to it. As recently as February 2026, Seattle Police Department spokesperson Sergeant Patrick Michaud stated, "The Kurt Cobain case remains closed. The department has no plans to revisit it. So what happened to Kurt Cobain's killer?" If you believe the official ruling and the Seattle Police, the King County Medical Examiner, Danny Goldberg, Nick Broomfield, there is no killer. Kurt Cobain was a brilliant, tormented man who battled addiction and depression for years, and who, after a failed suicide attempt in Rome and an escape from rehab, ended his own life on April 5, 1994. But if you believe Tom Grant, Michelle Wilkins, Neil Lowe, the forensic specialists, the handwriting analysts, and the various threads that have refused to unravel over 3 decades, then Kurt Cobain's killer has been hiding in plain sight for over 32 years. No arrest has ever been made. No charges have ever been filed. As of February 2026, the official record stands. Kurt Cobain's death remains classified as a suicide. The truth is, unless the case is reopened, and there is no indication that it will be, the answer to what happened to Kurt Cobain's killer depends entirely on which version of events you believe, and the fact that, more than 3 decades later, credentialed forensic specialists, retired police captains, and private investigators are still raising new questions suggests that this story is not finished, not by a long shot. Whether driven by unanswered questions, generational memory, or the enduring mystique of a cultural icon, the conversation around Kurt Cobain's death shows no sign of fading quietly into history.